Hello everyone, Former People is back from summer vacation. As many of you already know, we're changing the format of our podcast series a little bit. Today will be one of our themed-based podcasts. Although we recorded this probably a month and change ago, I think you're going to find that the timing of events, both very publicly and in some cases personally, made this particular podcast a little bit more relevant than we would have expected it to be, in both good ways and bad ways. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to our trauma podcast. So welcome everyone to our new-formed Former People Speaks podcast. Unlike our previous podcast, these podcasts we're going to sort of take a step back from the magazine as such and talk about a thematic topic which has interested us over the past month or has been on our minds for even longer, and we've decided to give form to it. And this month we've decided on trauma. And I'll start just for myself personally. Like, it's a subject which it's hard to escape from a lot of literature, in particular modernist literature. Even in formulating the name of our project, Former People suggests it both directly and indirectly, very historically based, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so it's just been something that's been on my mind for a while, and something I have thought about in terms of literature. And I think if you pay attention to the teaching of literature recently, you know, the subject sort of has come up without really coming up. So hopefully we have plenty to talk about, both in the history of literature, in some examples of film and pop culture which are relevant, and then wherever our random thoughts go. So Derek, I've introduced why this topic seems to have some interest for me. Why don't you do that?
I'm fascinated with trauma studies, which is interesting in and of itself. I'm interested in the stylization of trauma and the way that stylization can literally help you get beyond it. There is a study published very recently, like in the last year, that was talking about ancient Greek literature and PTSD, and how a psychologist was actually using some of the techniques of processing grief through mythologizing and tale sharing as a means of therapy that seemed to be part of the motivation behind, like, the Bard, Skald, and Homer traditions in the ancient world. Now, it's kind of speculative, but I think that's sort of in the background of a lot of literature. I also think that it's hard to talk about the traumatic and ironic literature and film. There are some exceptions, but it seems to me that is something that it's dealt with, but it's dealt with in a way that's at a distance, in a different way from, say, stylized trauma. You know what I mean when you feel like you're reading something that is artifice but confessional, as opposed to something that is just confessional. It's the difference between Sylvia Plath's poetry and Sylvia Plath's private letters. And that's a very interesting distinction to me. And how that all works together is very interesting to me as well.
Well, we should probably just go grand and look at it, because you had mentioned trauma occurring as early as ancient Greek literature. So it's basically been with us since the beginning. I mean, most obviously, you can talk about the Oedipal series of plays as just being one of many examples of this. And I guess this brings up to the point early on of how are we thinking literature functions? And in a way, you know, what do we make of these representations of trauma? I think in many instances that we've mentioned, at least more contemporary examples, we're getting a sense of trauma as some sort of therapeutic device, successful or not, for a lot of writers. So you mentioned Sylvia Plath. I mean, the trauma for her was very personal. You can go back for other writers, and it's very similar, even if the context is a bit different. So in Poland, the author Borowski was a concentration camp survivor. I don't believe he was Jewish, but he was a survivor of the camp, Auschwitz, and a lot of his stories sort of do something somewhat similar, trying to depict that camp life. Whether or not it was personally therapeutic is maybe a subject of debate. But earlier, it's not really the case, or at least we don't have any evidence to presume that the authors of the Greek tragedies were trying to be therapeutic to their own personal trauma. They were depicting it representationally, somewhat maybe on a national scale, or something that the audience could see and respond to, independent of some sort of psychoanalytical type response. So I get what do we then have to think about given this sort of dynamic? Is there something therapeutic? Or should trauma in literature be understood as something of a therapeutic exercise, or are there different forms of trauma, so on and so forth?
Well, I don't know that writing about trauma is always therapeutic. I think sometimes it's compulsive. Well, I told you that story about the PTSD sufferers in ancient mythologized epics, and the research done on that. There's a converse research about, all the confessional poets who were trying to sort of work out their emotions out loud. And the one note that you'll have about them, a lot of the stereotypes about poets being more likely to commit suicide, and the various studies on that, I've read 3 different stories and they have 3 different conclusions, which is strange since there should really only be 2. But one thing is for sure, in the 1950s, the confessional poets, the famous ones, overwhelmingly committed suicide. So I'm not saying that working out trauma in art is always for therapeutic purposes, or even is necessarily, even if it is for therapeutic purposes, particularly useful. Another thing about personal trauma is it does give you a really easy way to build something emotionally rich out of your life that may be therapeutic only in the sense that you're creating something, but it not be therapeutic in the sense that it actually fixes any of the trauma directly.
Yeah, so we're sort of having to go back to the very basic idea of catharsis in the old Greek tradition, and what exactly that was serving, right? So theoretically, is catharsis successful at really resolving any trauma? Yes or no? Maybe so. But it functions in literature. I mean, as you rightly said, and I'll change the language to reemphasize something another writer said. Happiness writes white, generally, right? Yeah. So even though many of our stories have happy endings or conclusions, a lot of the sort of European literary forebears, ancient Greek tragedy, obviously by virtue of its definition, Shakespearean tragedy, really jumping forward, and through much of our literature, like the happy quote-unquote ending doesn't seem to have the quote-unquote dramatic weight as having something very dark or ghastly, and frankly, yes, traumatic for the characters involved or us, and so there's almost, it's again going to the question of what is the said purpose of this? Are we does trauma in literature manifest an exercise in, as it were, developing the artifice and aesthetics of literature, the set enjoyment of it? Is it something deeper than that? Why do we in fact find some sort of enjoyment out of trauma, and why we keep reproducing it in our literature? It's it's hard to say. I personally, doesn't really matter to me whether or not an ending is bleak, dark, traumatic for the players involved or not. I do notice that there's a higher likelihood of me liking the story if there is a dark element to it, usually somewhat violent, emotionally or physically related to it.
Do you think that is because trauma, though, is easier to earn and also easier to earn in a open cultural context. So, for example, like if I read Aristophanes, like the clouds, which is basically ancient Greek dick jokes and The Daily Show, I'm not going to find that funny without training, probably. I'm not going to get the goats and I'm going to get the references. That's not always true. Like some Shakespearean comedies are still very funny, but then there's other ones. I think of like A Comedy of Errors, where most of the humor is completely lost to modern audiences about footnotes. And you don't have that problem with traumatic stories. So maybe the reason why we like traumatic stories more is it feels easier. It's a easier way to earn dramatic clout and to have the right plot tensions.
So I would say, yeah, there's probably some element to that. I don't think it necessarily even has to include a proper historical context understanding or not. I just think it's easier to get a response from an audience having a character gouge his eyes out than trying to have a verbal repartee with someone. I mean, yes, there's as you're right to point out, there's an inescapable element of references that are or are not going to be caught, and it's more apparent in the comedy, but not necessarily. I mean, you could always have, even in Comedy of Errors, I mean, part of the, half the jokes are, the whole notion of mistaken identity, and so, I mean, you don't really need context for that per se. But you're right. Yeah.
Sometimes the actual stakes of a dramatic tragedy are something dealing with some sort of trauma is very hard to understand outside of certain cultural contexts. I think of the movie Old Boy, which you have to understand very particular Korean notions of public and private for the punishment to make any sense at all. And when they tried to remake that film, it just came off as salaciously wrong-headed when put into an American context. It just didn't make that much sense. I mean, even with a very good director, very good actors behind it. And so, we should be careful about overplaying the fact that trauma doesn't have a cultural context. It very much does. It's just that cultural context does seem to be a little bit less specific.
Well, I think also a certain element of this has to do with the nature of the way this information is communicated. Again, we didn't really get into it, but I think it's a whole nature of how visual the matter is. Trauma tends to be more visceral a lot of times, which is why, for example, like when you were saying about comedy sort of being more limited by the cultural context, I think that has to do with linguistic comedy more so than others. Like, for example, silent films of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd really are, with a few exceptions, easily translatable, for lack of a better expression. I think that's, again, because their comedy tends to be on the more visceral or emotional side as opposed to a linguistic side. And I think that trauma in many instances exhibits that, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So again, why I mentioned, in the Oedipal complex, gouging out one's eyes. You really don't need to know the linguistics or the history behind that to understand that gouging out your eyes tends to be very bad indeed. And I think that's an element to it. What the other interesting phenomenon, again, if we go back to language, is that in some instances, stories which have an overlap between dark or traumatic and humor tends to lose out, or at least that overlap tends to be mistaken in an audience when they don't have the context for it. And I'm thinking in particular of Kafka. I mean, we hear every time you read about Kafka, and when he's talking about his stories in a non-self-hateful manner, you generally hear about how he would read these stories to his friends and they would laugh uproariously, even the ones we think of as like particularly insanely dark. I think even the trial even was mentioned as one case where that was happening.
Well, yeah, Kafka is interesting. Like, there's tons of puns in Kafka, some of which are dirty, and they're totally lost in English. You have to read the German to get them. And they play against the whole, Kafka as overwhelming nihilist. I'm thinking of probably his first short story written. I'm trying to remember. It's about the man whose dad stops him from marrying his fiancée, and he hangs himself on the bridge. The word that he uses in German means both like to die and to ejaculate at the moment when he jumps off. It's hilarious, apparently, in German. It does not, when you read the story now, it's Das Urteil, the judgment. When you read the story now, in English, you completely lose that, like, absurd sexual humor that is in there. It's just gone. And you read, like, The Trial of the Metamorphosis, and it just seems horrific. It's hard to say with Kafka, particularly. You can think of... Can you think of filmmakers whose visual cues for trauma might be so culturally specific that they would be hard?
Hard to translate, visuals that are hard to translate. I honestly can't think of.
They would be hard to understand. I'm thinking because when we think of the traumatic experience, we think of bold, shocking, gouge your eyes out, Oedipal things. But if I think of something like, say, Kate Chopin's Awakening, where obviously that wife has been traumatized by something, and she eventually kills herself, but not even really actively, she just sort of floats out into the water and dies.
Arguably, that situation, it's easy for people to miss that, even if they are in the language and context of the original.
Well, yeah, all speak English, right? I mean, well, not everybody who possibly listens to this, but you and I both speak English, and most of the people who would have read The Awakening with me in college spoke English. Most of them didn't get it. Mm-hmm. So I was very interested in that, and I'm trying to think of visual parallels to it.
It's hard because even we recently talked about Chinatown, and independent of the very visual ending, if you think about the big reveal in the movie, she's my sister, my daughter, my sister, she's my sister and my daughter, that's linguistic based, but it's not a translation issue. That is very clear, right, what's happening there. So and I'm thinking through this, the only thing I could, again, it's hard because I don't even know if he is translated at all. I mean, I'm sure that you can get his work with subtitles. I would say sometimes Spalding Gray's monologues, while exhibiting an idea of the trauma, it's more like a build-up per se, or it's a sense of unease. But again, it's also debatable if that's even visual.
Right. It's his stuff it's not verbal, but it's verbal in a
performing way. It's
a performance way. Yeah. Because it's not just listening to what he's doing; it's a kind of manic intensity and then relaxation, oscillation, and crescendoing he does that indicates to you that there's something going wrong. I mean, obviously, with Spalding Gray's case, apparently there really was something going wrong
at the end, for sure.
But so those one-man shows feel a lot more haunting in retrospect. It's interesting to take a side note from your Bête Noire. Listeners of the old editorial podcast would always hear the monthly rant that usually involved Jonathan Franzen and our David Foster Wallace. But in this way, David Foster Wallace is quite a bit like Spalding Gray.
Yeah, so the thing to keep in mind with Spalding Gray versus David Foster Wallace is that for David Foster Wallace, I would say the traumatic characteristic of his work that ultimately culminated in his suicide was much more wide-reaching and probably more likely to happen if you look at his trajectory than Spalding Gray's. Yes, Spalding Gray was very troubled throughout his life. I think his mother had committed suicide, but Spalding Gray's suicide when it ultimately happened was in the aftermath of a very traumatic car crash that happened in Ireland. So his is much more specific to a physical event which had a severe wound to him, as opposed to David Foster Wallace, which was just the nature of his very being. But you're absolutely right in bringing up David Foster Wallace versus Jonathan Franzen, is that Jonathan Franzen, although, prone to writing about families in collapse and in disarray and troubled by its past, is not a very good communicator of it, in part because I think when you compare him to David Foster Wallace, the unease and troublesomeness in David Foster Wallace is apparent in the very DNA of the writing. It is not put on like an added layer of frosting on the cake. It is baked into the cake.
Yeah, and it's sort of omnipresent. Even like the short story about Alex Trebek.
Yeah,
has this weird undercurrent of OCD-esque like trauma response. But the other thing about trauma, and I think it's interesting to talk about it like this way, to go back to catharsis for a minute, is we tend to over pathologize things, and right now you and I are too. I'm hypersensitive to PTSD issues, but I think a lot of our tendency to pathologize fiction that is traumatic, even if it comes out of a place of real personal trauma for the writer or writers, plural, because film is often has multiple authors, even if it's only given to one screen credit, is that I think you can really misread a work by over pathologizing the work onto the individual and then back onto the work.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's the authorial fallacy and blah, blah, blah. But I think, I don't just mean that in the, hey, let's talk about basic English reading skills sort of sense. I mean, like, there's a lot of that, I think, where people assume that the trauma of a work must reflect the trauma of the author. And I can think of a very excellent example of where that line is really blurry. The Things They Carried. You're familiar with the book. Most everybody is. But, the author deliberately conflates parts of his actual life, and then there's parts of it that are completely made up. And since it all uses the author's name as an implied narrator, it's almost impossible to tell what is real trauma to the author and what is like cultural trauma that he's trying to represent, and what is, fictive trauma that's only trauma for the people in the fiction. It's very elusive in that way because it baits you even to do the exact misreading that we're saying not to do, which is to biographize and pathologize it, then to project that reading of the author back onto the work.
It's an interesting, conundrum in which, if this was really an exercise in personal therapy, I mean, really in the sense of, like, I'm writing this to resolve an issue for myself, which I don't want to say, authors never do, but it, from what the author is concerned with regards to himself or herself, ultimately is immaterial to the audience. So the question is why would the audience respond to it? It's like, if the audience is going to go through this exercise of pathologizing the work through the author and then reading it back onto the work in a way that's a mechanism the audience is using of distancing itself from the work, but it's already a failure of an exercise because you've already sort of projected into yourself or some reason to read the work and go through the exercise of pathologizing the author. So it's a question of, okay, then how is this work affecting you? In a way, I am loathed to go to the conclusion that we are reading these because we're all little more than peeping toms. I mean, yes, I think there's probably some truth to that. I mean, like, everybody always wants to, see like, oh, what are the dirty secrets of next door, as it were. But that doesn't answer the question of why do you want to know the dirty secrets?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, to go more into your point, I think you're exactly right, because to project that back onto the author and then project that back into your reading, which is this weird double projection thing, you are denying yourself any possibility of catharsis. You cannot identify with the character. You are placing the identification with the author, who is not you. And I think confessional poetry, like, sadly invites this reading, but you see it all over the place. You think about all the reactions people had to J.G. Ballard's Crash. J.G. Ballard, I think, is undoubtedly a traumatized person. There are reasons to believe why he would be. I mean, read the autobiographical fiction and figure out what he lived through in Shanghai. It's impossible to think that didn't affect him.
Yes, there's two elements. One, you're right, in the Shanghai, everybody has been aware of Empire of the Sun, and the funny thing is, like, depending on how you came into contact with J.G. Ballard, your response to Empire of the Sun, or conversely, the rest of J.G. Ballard's work, can get kind of creepy or weird. Like, some people who read Crash first and then came to read the Empire of the Sun took it in many respects as, okay, I understand why this man wrote Crash, in a way.
Right.
Conversely,
I think the wrong way to read it, even though my mention of reading that is Ballard knows trauma, but he's not. I don't think Crash is about his trauma.
Well, it's not. There's two traumas in Ballard's life. One, you get in Empire of the Sun, which is going through the basically pre-World War II and World War II. But in his second autobiographical book, which takes him out of Shanghai, The Kindness of Women, that concludes with, I think, probably the more proximal tragedy to him, the one that he probably even felt more like a traumatic event, which was the death of his wife very young from cancer, and he was alone having to raise his two children. That happens, I would say, in the mid to late 60s, and that's a very very noticeable time for that to happen, in that immediately after that, his writing becomes less sci-fi-y and more extreme kind of fiction. So the Atrocity Exhibition comes after that, Crash comes after that, so on and so forth.
What's the transition books that happen then? Is it the various world books where you get these apocalyptic scenarios? I'm trying to remember when those are written.
So his
period.
Yeah, so his early sci-fi is like really in the early 60s. So Winds from Nowhere, Drowned World, Burning World, those are 61, 62, and 64 respectively. Crystal World is 66. In 1964, his wife dies of pneumonia. And he has 3 children to raise on his own. So, okay, the death occurs in 64, so you'd say 66 and 65, 66, 67.
So he writes that apocalyptic trilogy, which is already beginning to move in the direction he's going, and then stuff gets more and more extreme.
Exactly, yeah. So Crystal World appears afterwards, but it's conceivable that he could have started writing that before. But like,
and it's during, yeah. It almost had to be partly composed during.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And then you get some of the more interesting collections of his short stories as well. So we mentioned the Atrocity Exhibition, but there's Vermilion Sands, which is a couple years afterwards, which is still sci-fi, but it's definitely more of a cultural critique as opposed to, it always was cultural critique, but less of an emphasis on the weirdness of the science fiction world and more on the weirdness of people.
Right. It's very interesting to read through his collected short stories because they're chronologically ordered, and the first ones they're almost like standard, classic sci-fi stories. They're weirder than that, but they're not psychological in the same way. They're not as intensely disturbing. And around the period of Crystal World, everything does change. And then, over time, I think once you get to Crash, things start reverting back things seem less traumatic. I mean, I don't know. I shouldn't say that because High Rise is pretty messed up, but it's not the same sort of thing. And you have The Empire of the Sun and The Kindness of Women, and then he writes his essays and his autobiography later on, and it seems like he's actually kind of gone through that now. But like I said, when you read Crash in light of his autobiography alone, you are removing the self-implication, which is like the main point of Crash.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it reminds me of, and I think you're more skeptical of him than I am, is like what Jung's take on psychoanalysis. He says it's not only just nor often the individual who is sick, but is the society which is itself sick. So that to me
feels, I agree with that. I just don't agree with the rest of it.
Yeah. But yeah, that is very much J.G. Ballard's the point of a lot of his later fiction. And the other thing is, if you want to read in his autobiography into his work, then you have to deal with the fact that, basically all interviews with him after his wife's death, even to the end of his life, he's actually a very chipper, very bourgeois, happy-ish, English suburban gentleman. I mean, there was very little in him, and even from people who knew him and talked to him, that came across as like, this man is in a lot of pain. I'm not going to say like he was completely cold to what happened to him, but you have to read that into his work as well if you want to play the autobiography game. But nobody is really going to do that,
right? Well, you have to do that with a lot of people. I think like when people talk about Nabokov and his obsession with nymphets, which comes up a lot because it does. People think about Lolita. The only reason why I do think there is something going on there is that theme presents itself like 5 or 6 times. He's like
pretty much in every. There are stories before Lolita, and pretty much everything afterwards. It's there, and if it's not there, the other thing that's there tends to be incest.
Right. I mean, it's like Ada or Adore, which has all of it. I mean, like the what was it? The something of Laura. My mind is
the original of Laura, which was the book which he did not want published, but was
Treacherous Son. But Treacherous Son aside, it is interesting because the original of Laura is sort of a yet again going back into the territory of Lolita. It's interesting because I think you can read Lolita, Humbert and Lolita both are enacting trauma upon themselves.
Yes.
And I will say, even though Nabokov is amoral in his aestheticism, completely, he does not let Humbert off the hook because of his trauma. In fact, I think he kind of hangs him with it.
Well, this is why people sort of refer to Nabokov as the cruel writer in many respects. He will very coldly and objectively create these situations, and literally, I mean, to say he puts his characters through the ringer is really underselling what exactly his characters go through in his stories almost universally. Except for Pnin, which is more of a comedy. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this Nabokov is it's difficult talking about what is the purpose of Nabokov's Lolita, or in general his writing, because he was so loath to say that his books are supposed to have meaning or messages, and I agree with that. And then at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that upon reading it, one is without recourse to want to conceive of the stories in a way to construct a moral message. And I don't think Nabokov would even disagree with that. And if you read it, you're absolutely right. When you read Lolita, it isn't an apology for Humbert, because even if it was an apology for Humbert, Nabokov would be also lying and saying there's no moral message of the book, because there would be. It would just be a defense of Humbert, and it's not, right? So right. I mean, he is. If you really read Nabokov, he would say he is a slave to a certain extent to the demands that the artifice of literature requires, and so I think the way this is my gut feeling is that if he were to write it as a sort of pure moral play, he would find it like a failure of his aesthetic. But also, if he were to just let Humbert off the hook, as it were, or have that character without really exploring the implications of what that life would be, he would also be failing in that aesthetic goal of, creating a vivid world of emotion, tears, heartbreak, all that kind of jazz.
Mm-hmm. It is fascinating to me that the worlds that Nabokov make aren't real in any sense. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, they're not real in the sense that they are deliberately artifice. But the moral conclusions that you draw from that, they just naturally come out of the artifice itself. You can't miss what happens to Humbert and Lolita and how he destroys her and himself. But you also, you have to arrive there through him and through his own foolishness. And I appreciate that, because the only reason I think people get so obsessed into reading the back onto Nabokov is because it is such a repetitive theme. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to ignore. When a writer seems to come back to the same thing over and over again, and I say this as a writer, there is usually something they're working out.
No, I would agree with that as well, for sure. Though at the same time, it's also, if we were to be in a situation where we were forced to have, a 2-line summary of an author's life or work, Lolita would invariably, and Nabokov too, would invariably get dirty book about, fucking young girls, or writer who wrote dirty book about fucking young girls, and that while maybe scratching at the surface of something that always was in Nabokov's head, it is nevertheless missing. It would be an inaccurate summation of what you are exposed to in Nabokov as well.
Yeah.
Right. So we have this. It's a very complicated web we weave, indeed. And again, I find myself going back to the question: for what purpose does the depiction or exploration of trauma serve? Again, right? It seems like a question which should be easy to answer, but invariably is not.
Right. I mean, you think about a book, a series of books. Just so we don't always mention men, I'm going to go pull from traumatized women. Marguerite Duras, The Lover, and The China Lover, and to some extent Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is the movie about Hiroshima, but still has elements of The Lover in it. You have this repeated going back to this one story of a young white French women in Indochina falling in love with an Asian man who's much, much older and going through that, which seems both traumatized and also loving, and it's not like Stockholm Syndrome loving. But the book gets written almost twice. And that's really fascinating to me, and how they're different is really fascinating to me, because one, The Lover, has a lot more artifice in it than the other. The China Lover. It doesn't help that their names are so similar.
But it does lend credence to this idea that we keep going back to the same central feeling. It's to the point where even the names of the work aren't really that different.
Right. No, I mean, it's literally the same story, but they're told different ways. It's like she wrote one book and then decided to write the next, but I can't even remember which one was written first. It's been a long time since I've read those books. But it's very interesting to me how certain writers seem to not be able to escape that. At the same token, I mean, we can talk about cultural trauma and how it lends us to react to trauma in art.
Right. So I hinted at it with Borowski. Well, not even hinted at it. I mean, we just talked about it briefly. The Holocaust is the central trauma. Well, not even. I mean the Holocaust broadly. I would.
Yeah, you're not even referring to the Shoah. You're referring to the entire thing.
I would refer to everything from 1914 through arguably 1960.
AKA those years that it really sucked to be Polish.
those years that suck to live anywhere between Central Europe and, shall we say, the Pacific.
The best American book on that topic, I think, is William Vollmann's Europe Central. It's huge. I mean, for one thing, I don't think Vollmann can write a book that's not like 8,000 words. I mean, you're talking about a man who literally wrote a 5-volume limited edition Max Sweeney's Press book on justifications of violence in his relationship to trauma based on reporting he did over 20 years. I mean, and then he also at the same time wrote like 3 over 800-page novels.
He's nothing if not consistent.
Yeah, well, actually his writing's very kind of inconsistent, but he's consistently prolific, that's for sure. But Europe Central is an excellent book on that. I mean, it doesn't so much go into Poland, but it's just all the scarring of Europe. And I think if you look at Central European and in further Eastern cinema, it does have a different feel to it than Western European and American cinema or to Russian cinema.
Well, so knowing
obviously
Polish
does, and so does Romanian.
Yeah, knowing Polish cinema like I do, you see it very directly. But I would say German cinema has it too. I would say any cinema you're going to get that is Central European is going to exhibit features even later, even in the quote-unquote more postmodern era, if you want to use that term, of literature. It's going to always have a very strong, serious layer to it. I'm not going to say, well, Central Europe does not produce comedies or can't be funny. That's an obvious lie.
No, they're hilarious, but they're often hilarious in an incredibly bloody manner. I'm thinking of like, not Polish films, but like the Serbian film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just evil funny. It's a dark comedy. I know most people wouldn't find it funny, but it's obviously supposed to be partly funny. But it's horrible.
Well, even Dusan Mickiewicz, very famous. I always forget if he's Serbian or. He's just vague. I can be comfortable enough saying he was a Yugoslav filmmaker, famous for the film W.R. Mysteries of the Organism, nominally about Wilhelm Reich, but it's also about sort of like sexuality in America and Yugoslavia. Even that is weighted down by basically the communist control of his country and Eastern Europe. Plus, even in his when he's in the United States, also what happened to Wilhelm Reich at the end of his life, with what which was a surprisingly unpleasant move by the Eisenhower administration, basically to burn his books and punish him and arrest him for basically nothing. Even that, I mean, that's a hysterically funny movie, but it's still tinged with this complicated history, as it were.
Or think about the poetry of Charles Simic.
Mm-hmm.
Who can get that complicated, dark, light, hilarious, yet also like awful, also absurd into 14, 15, 5 lines. Mm-hmm. And that's in his poetry, I mean, it's in English and it's very American in one sense because it's obviously out of the William Carlos Williams tradition, but it's so Eastern European in another. Its humor is not American. The ability to go from like, oh, this woman is cleaning my teeth, some wry observation about my childhood, and then mass graves.
I would say that humor does sort of become American to the extent to which Eastern European and in particular Jewish writers and directors become.
Eastern European is darker than the Jewish humor, quite frankly.
Well, yes, but some of those Eastern European, some of those Jews in America who are noted for their humor are Eastern European. Billy Wilder is Polish Jewish. He escapes before World War II, but he escapes right before the Nazis take over in Germany. But yeah, that some of those guys do come over and bring it to the United States. But you're right, it does exist, but it exists in a limited way, and to the extent to which the Europeans successfully or unsuccessfully merge with American culture.
So that, again, sort of revises our thing that trauma can't be funny. Of course it can. But it's a very particular kind of funny. And I think trauma in humor is actually maybe harder to translate than even just regular old humor. I think maybe the only thing harder to translate is satire. But trauma and humor is, I mean, what's the difference between a tragedy and a comedy in a lot of ways is, classically, it's just that there's a wedding at the end. And,
well, clearly we have a definition from Woody Allen and Alan Alda, which is comedy is tragedy plus time.
Right. Or comedy is when somebody else gets hit in the face, and tragedy is when you do.
Yeah.
But they are very intimately related. I'm also thinking about things that sort of break the tragedy comedy catharsis wall. So, I am kind of obsessed with this terrible bit of pop culture, the Hannibal TV show, which I find superior to most of the movies, save maybe Manhunter and Silence of the Lambs, and even that's questionable. Which is not to say it's great TV. I was literally screaming at my television over the finale of the second season, so I'm not going to go into that. But that is about, in this gothic and absurdly, surreally metaphorical way, plus, serial killers every week. That world must be peopled with like 40% serial killers, I think.
Yeah, I think it takes place. I mean, the books took place in Baltimore or the Baltimore area. I'm assuming the TV show does as well.
TV show takes place with Virginia to Baltimore in that triangle. However, since they're in the FBI, they go all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, like, there's literally like totem poles built out of human bodies at one point.
Yeah, it would suggest a more difficult. Living a more difficult life in the United States than it really is. Yeah.
Just, it makes it seem like, oh, there's a serial killer every other week.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it is funny. It's like, yeah, go ahead.
But the main character who has the empathy disorder, and basically he can't stop himself from empathizing with both the victim and the killer. And basically is just constantly traumatizing himself. To the point he breaks and reforms his personality several times.
Yeah, I did see the TV show, which is in many respects trying to take Red Dragon, which was filmed first as Manhunter, and make it a TV show. I've seen a couple episodes of the TV show, thought it was okay, but still felt it was inferior to the way William Peterson is able to depict that empathy issue. I mean, because William Peterson, if you do watch Manhunter, is really scandalously underrated as an actor. I think probably because we mostly associate him now with taking CSI and using it as a cash cow, which is understandable from an actor's perspective. But he really had that capability of describing the situation which you're illustrating.
Manhunter's interesting in that Manhunter understands, even probably more than Tom Harris does, that the most interesting character in that book is not Hannibal Lecter, is Will. And the show kind of gets that. It does seem to make Hannibal into a super being, but at least he's consistently evil and unlikable as a super being in that show.
It's interesting also, what is the role of Hannibal as that sort of character evolved? Originally, again, if we're thinking about trauma, even through Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter isn't what he became, which was that, I eat rude people and therefore I'm the likable serial killer, which is just a disgusting sort of development that I have encountered in a number of places in American culture. I mean, there's like a famous line about Hannibal. It's like, nothing happened to me, I happened, I think was a line from Silence of the Lambs. The point being is that Hannibal is not supposed to be some sort of like guy you have sympathy with. He is an element of, or the force which is facilitating this traumatic event either for Will. I mean, he knows exactly how to set Will off. I mean, as the sort of Machiavellian chess master that Hannibal is in that original story, or in Silence of the Lambs, doing something very similarly with Clarice Starling. You know, I mean, it's funny how we as a society create, you know, we start with these dark characters, or at least dark themes, but we still in the process of humanizing them, which theoretically is not a horrible thing to want to try to come up with a sense of like what makes this person tick. I mean, but we do it in such a way that, ironically enough, doesn't really humanize them. It just creates them as, like a teddy bear or something, you know, that is more easily digestible. I mean, like humanizing someone doesn't, you know, or if you really humanize someone, you don't necessarily resolve questions. You just create more questions theoretically.
Right, which I like about the show and Manhunter, and I don't like about the remake of Manhunter or Red Dragon, the movie. And I also think, even though I love Ed Norton as an actor, actually at that time period, probably his height, he doesn't seem to get that character.
Oh yeah, it was a complete failure, and really only existed as a means of allowing Anthony Hopkins to be Hannibal Lecter yet again.
Which you think, you know. Whereas this has given it up, and honestly, the actor that had playing Hannibal is much better.
Well, in the TV show now, I mean, the actor playing Hannibal is the only actor I've encountered who's convincingly a Lithuanian nobleman.
Right. Is he convinced a Lithuanian nobleman, surgeon, turned psychologist, turned ninja?
Working in the U.S., in Baltimore. Like they do. Like all Lithuanian noblemen do.
Which, I'm just going to set aside, oh my God, did Tom Harris jump the shark on his own idea? But, because you can't blame that on the movies.
No, that's completely... It came out of... It first came out in Hannibal, and it really was explored in Hannibal Rising, and I think like
Batman. I mean, like,
yeah, like I think Martin Amis said, like, you know, Thomas Harris, you know, got used to too many expensive meals, and, you know, ergo we got the Hannibal we have today.
And unfortunately, that is still sort of part of the show, but they play that way down. But yes, he's convincingly a nobleman. He's also convincingly the devil. And even though there are moments where you half sympathize with him, you know you shouldn't, unlike in the movies, or frankly the books, which are even worse, where he like convinces Clarice Starling to run off with him as his lover, and they eat people's brains together forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah, that was an improvement that Ridley Scott allowed to happen in his filming of Hannibal.
Which is sad when I say that movie was actually better than something in the book.
I do. I also think that Anthony Hopkins' portrayal is better in Hannibal than in Silence of the Lambs, because I think Anthony Hopkins plays a clown in Silence of the Lambs, whereas Hannibal is somewhat different.
Yeah, I think Anthony Hopkins, and I think also Julianne Moore does a good job. I mean, not Julianne Moore. Julianne Moore does a good job with Clarice Starling. The problem with that movie is just its source material is not good, and they don't do enough. They don't seem to be, even though they rewrite some major moments, they don't really seem to do enough to save it.
It's fun. That's one of those movies where I would have loved to have been able to read the rewrites, because you don't have weak writers doing that. The first draft of that script was David Mamet. And the second draft, which was filmed, is Steve Zaillian.
One day you and I have to talk about the Alien movies and that exact problem. But that has nothing to do with trauma, except for my trauma of watching Aliens 3. So...
yeah, but I mean, you know, you're right, and that again raises an interesting question, you know, which Will Graham's perfectly represents. It's like, to what extent does Will Graham's problem with empathy sort of represent the condition we're kind of in now? Because, like, you know, because yes, I mean, theoretically you would say, oh, empathizing with the people you're involved with, how can that be a bad thing? It's like, well, Will Graham represents that, because it's, he overemphasizes with everyone, and it's something he can barely deal with.
Right, he basically becomes autistic because he can't stop empathizing, which is the converse of what, he can't have human relationships. He manifests like something on the autism spectrum, which is the opposite of empathizing.
Right, it's the absolute. I think one of the working definitions of autism is that it's a failure of the mind to actually function as a means of connecting with human to humans on that level.
Right.
And what's interesting about that, and maybe I'm overreaching with this, or so you can bash me down, but that's. I wouldn't say it's a metaphor for like what we're dealing with now in society, but it seems to have a place in it where, like, it feels like to me, the tone of public discourse is all about emotional empathy or emotional sensitivity. Like, the emotions govern almost everything we do to a certain respect now.
And they're about current emotions, not long-term emotions. I've had my arguments about trigger warnings, and I shouldn't probably link this up. And I don't have a problem with the explicitly warning people the kind of content might be in a book. But I don't think that's what trigger warnings actually do. When you have to, like, on this page, such and such happens, or whatever, because you have to make it so people can avoid it. But that's avoiding a traumatic breakdown in a short-term context, and yes, that can even cause physical pain. I know the stuff. I work with people who've had PTSD. I have soldiers in my family. I have mild PTSD myself from some events that happened involving cars when I was a teenager, and I don't like driving. But I've also learned that the actual psychological literature is much more mixed on what that would do, because triggers, quote-unquote triggers, are what the psychologists will call the impetus for emotional dysregulation, which is a terrible phrase, but is something that you can't know what's going to do it. All right? I mean, if you've ever been around, like war-traumatized soldiers, you really don't know what's going to set them off. You could click a spoon wrong and it can remind them of a sound and they're gone. And you could show them a violent movie and they'll be fine.
It's funny. This, not directly this issue, but sort of related to it, came up with Taxi Driver. And Paul Schrader talks about this in interviews about the movie. Definitely in the aftermath of the shooting of Ronald Reagan, very, very, very famously, dressed very much like a Travis Bickle type character. Schrader's point was very similar to yours, is that the guys who basically live in this space that Travis Bickle does, a certain type of white male, which, frankly, all three of the principal males involved with Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese, Paul Schrader, and Robert De Niro, all admit in aftermath that, yes, they were in that headspace, not just for the creation of the movie, but they said in that period of time in their life when they were Travis Bickle's age, they were basically like Travis Bickle. All three of them admit to this. Anything will set those off. They're not necessarily triggered by the movie Taxi Driver. They're triggered by anything that's going to happen in the society. You can't really predict it. And Schrader's point was like, you can get rid of crime and punishment, but you don't get rid of Raskolnikov. If you censored crime and punishment, you created a world where you still have Raskolnikov. You don't have crime and punishment. And to me, that's sort of, again, getting to this whole point of like, are we or are we not trying to help someone when we come up with these ideas of trigger warnings? And to me, the other interesting factor, whenever I would hear people describe trigger warnings, they're examples of like sample text that they would use to discuss, to have like a trigger warning on The Great Gatsby, Huck Finn, Lolita. None of those books. I mean, let's be honest. Everybody knows the basic thing that's in those books is that's going to cause a trigger. I mean, if you've been in this society long enough, you have. So to me, the whole issue of like, well, we want to be sensitive to someone so that they can be prepared while entering this text seems to me like a stretch of logic, and they'll find out very quickly before they even read the book about this. So to me, there seemed something else at stake.
Well, and I think as a good teacher, you would cover the base. Like, I wouldn't give away spoilers, but quote unquote terminology now, but I wouldn't give away the ending. But I would have gone through my class and warned them a little bit about what they were reading. Not even because, for example, Mona Simpson's Lawns, which is a classic short story. This is often taught in college. It's about incest, and very indirectly. It's actually about someone living through the trauma afterwards. I always warn students about that. But that's not... I don't know that that's the same thing as trigger warnings in this book might discuss things that will, racism and ableism. For one thing, I don't know that anybody can catch all the things that people might see as. When I think about things that bring up memories of experiencing racism in the South, one of the things that'll bring it up to me is cabbage. All right. And it's about like a family that had a cabbage garden that lived next to me, because I lived in a very poor neighborhood, a very next neighborhood. And I wasn't allowed to play with that kid because my parents had decided that it looked weird for me to be hanging out with black kids over the age of 8. And I'm actually kind of mixed race myself, which makes that even more interesting. But there's nothing gonna warn. I don't think I have any trauma over that, but there's nothing going to warn, anybody that like, oh, we're going to read a poem about cabbages, and I'm going to have flashbacks about.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a whole question. It reveals that how we cannot predict how memory works. Right. Which is critical to this whole notion of trauma, right? It's inescapably tied to memory, forgotten memory, what you want to remember, what you don't want to remember. And, you only have to look at, stream of consciousness fiction to see how fluidic and specific to each person, the flow of sounds, sights, and smells will allow for the reminiscence of things. I mean, exactly. And again, it goes back to my point. It's like, you will never know, nor will you ever be prepared for the cultural or imagery cues which will set off memory.
No, and I think smell actually more than even visual impetus. I can't be around burning hair to this day, but it's one of these things that I think a lot of our ideas right now, and to bring it back to your Real Grand point, we are empathizing so much that we don't see the picture. That we're not that, like when I pointed out to a friend of mine that the Oberlin College standards on this, that was a school that actually tried to make a trigger warning guideline. It wasn't a policy, it wasn't enforced, so it wasn't the end of the world even then. But you couldn't get an operational definition of what a trigger would be from it. It was like, because everything and nothing could be a trigger. And it didn't even seem to realistically address that. And particularly when it suggested that, like, oh, if you must teach literature such as Things Fall Apart, suggesting like, oh, that most of the time you should just skip it. But how can you skip, cabbages? And I think it just gives you a false illusion of safety. And I also think it's empathizing without empathizing. It's,
well, I know this will sound, like a, sort of like a tough guy kind of like, suck it up and deal with it kind of thing, but it's not. It really does raise the question of, okay, you have this traumatic there's something in the story which could theoretically link you as an audience member to something traumatic in your past, regardless of whether or not the story is or is itself depicting trauma. But the question then becomes like, what works best for dealing with the situation, avoiding it or encountering it and trying to deal with it? I honestly don't know for sure the answer, but just based on personal experience with things that have troubled me, ignoring things tend to make matters worse. in a weird way, or it at the very least makes coping mechanisms more and more difficult.
Yeah, I don't know that trigger warnings would actually have to do that, but then what are they more than just doing your due diligence and telling kids a little bit about the context of what they're reading? And I don't have to do that with trigger warning. I can just be like, there are things in this book that are uncomfortable. We'll talk about them. And if you can't get through it, then you can't get through it, but you should try. And that's I know maybe I'm old-fashioned in that way, but that's not a tough man attitude. That's me. That's like exposure therapy, kind of. And I also think if you empathize with everyone, you don't empathize with anyone very well. Or in the case of a real Graham, to go back to our Hannibal character, you empathize with everyone so well, you can't draw all the necessary conclusions about the people around you. And all the right conclusions about your culture either.
Yeah, there's a certain quickness to this empathy that we're sort of talking about in this context, right? You know, there's a sense of...
Well, I don't really believe it's empathy, for one thing. I don't. I think it's signaling. But
there's also, you know, we have the sense of like, oh, you know, reading this book is harmful to her, don't you see, or him or her, don't you see we should stop, or something, you know, that response, or you should, you know, help them through it. I mean, that to me is like, okay, you're responding to that person's feelings in the moment, but you know, how are you helping and empathizing with that person in the broader context of this person has some sort of troubling events? How are we going to help him or her deal with it? You know, you can build up concentric circles beyond that. That requires pause, reflection, and thought. It does, you know, but it's just something I've noticed that like we just respond to an instantaneous environment, you know, or just the presence without looking backward or forward. And to me, that's sort of like what this represents. It's not really a manifestation of really trying to your point, understand the personal or cultural history and governing factors which are, you know, creating the situation. And also the other thing that I wonder about is, like, as you put it, like, good teaching is in of itself functions like a trigger warning. So to me, when people talk about this sort of event as something, you know, that's helpful, I mean, like, well, why do you feel the need to do it? I mean, isn't, you know, sort of like good teaching already occupying this role? And I don't think just saying like, well, this is just a way of ensuring that good teaching happens. Like, no, that's insufficient to me. I think there has to be something. Well,
that's a big difference between. Let's even grant the general. For one thing, to get off on a tangent about trigger warnings, we'll come back to culture, dear listeners. I know, as Greg Proops says, this is the boring, preachy part. Although, if you're not interested in culture and cultural questions, listeners, then the whole thing is a boring, preachy part. But sorry, I had to meta address here. Let's look at like what. Let's even take the premise of trigger warnings in blogs as legitimate. There's questions about it. I mean, and there's real questions about it. It's actually debated in the feminist community much more than people realize. Jezebel doesn't use them, but defends their use. But there was the Ruckus had a feminist author who said that it was, you know, basically that it was a form of self-deception. That you can't protect people from, you don't understand triggers if you think you protect people from, which is sort of my point too. But let's say that, let's grant all that. Let's not even raise those questions. On the internet, you really, on the feed of social media, you really don't really know what's coming at you. And you don't have anyone guiding you. In a classroom, it's completely different. And if the teacher is not guiding you, there's a problem. Like, I'm not saying the teacher has to hold every student's hand, but an instructor's job is to help people and facilitate people, you know, as best as they can for what they understand the long-term best interest to be and what the individual understands the long-term best interest to be. And yes, professors may need guidelines and training or whatever on this matter, like high school teachers do get, actually, more than college professors do. But that does not look like trigger warnings. That looks like telling the kids what they need to be in for and being there for them when it happens, because it's probably going to. And I think that's the difference between a long-term and a short-term view, and that's the difference between. This is a really stretched metaphor at this point, but that's the difference between Will Graham, who can catch serial killers, and Will Graham, who can let Hannibal manipulate him into being a horrible person.
I completely agree with that. I mean, like, the whole environment of teaching books in a classroom is precisely that layer of someone is in a position to guide you through it, whether or not they are, they're Aristotelian or Socratic in their method of doing so. I mean, it's just a presence that's there. So yes, it's a completely different situation for sure.
There's all kinds of other issues. I'm going to grant that. I'm going to grant all these complaints, right? But it's just the one-to-one commentary off of, even if it works from blog culture, that doesn't really stand out. And I think you see it generationally too, because the people who spoke up against trigger warnings at Oberlin College were not all conservatives, or not even mostly, probably.
It's very strange, the whole notion of like a conservative voice on this. I feel like conservatives have sort of washed their hands of academia at this point. They've jumped the ship, and
the research on that indicates that they really have. They have self-selected themselves out, and that the research actually indicates it's self-selection. They just do, like most conservatives, even before they go into school, are not interested in things that would go into academia because of ideas they have about academia. And I'm not a conservative in most ways, but I actually do think that is a loss.
Oh, it's imagine, the academic world without, Leo Strauss, without the Blooms, without
even if I want to strangle them.
Yeah.
But even more than that, let's go deeper than that, because Leo Strauss is almost a liberal. He's just a very angry one. In a lot of ways. I mean, he's still, like, without a Russell Kirk, without a Flannery O'Connor, this is something very different. I mean, for another thing, like, when you think of the politics of writers, and we've talked about this before on the editorial podcast, but even from a progressive point of view, some of the best writers are not liberals or leftist or whatever. They might have liberal or leftist sympathies somewhat, or they might just have sympathies with the characters. But didactic literature, it's painful. And it's not realistic to trauma at all, to stay on the topic of trauma. It is, didactic trauma always feels false. When you read a lot of it's the difference between Kate Chopin and Upton Sinclair.
I was just about to say Upton Sinclair.
I mean, because I really think, for example, There Will Be Blood is a better movie than Oil apostrophe.
Oil exclamation point, as I always say.
Excuse me. Oil exclamation point is a book, like, way better. And a lot of it has to do with Arthas, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're stuck with characters instead of social movements. And you don't feel like the violence is happening just to be instructive. You feel like the violence is happening because it is part of what the character is.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's why I always tell people that invariably you would get the reading of There Will Be Blood as, like, this is the story of how American business and American, religious fundamentalism married each other. I said, really? That's your reading of it? You completely ignore the personal, wretchedness of the main characters, and not to mention the even simple fact that they don't get along at all, and, like, one, is hell-bent on ensuring the destruction of the other.
And does,
yeah.
I mean, actually, they're mutually bent on ensuring the destruction of the other, and does. And I think, yes, there is an element of that, because that's actually probably explicitly what Upton Sinclair is writing about. Although, to be honest, I actually don't know that, because the fundamentalists of the time Upton Sinclair were writing were politically split. People forget this. William Jennings Bryan was a fundie.
Yes, oh, for sure.
And he was, he was almost a socialist. I know that there's the Once a Man in Kansas story, but that's actually the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, was really truly full of socialists, and now it's like basically an arm of the Republican Party. It's interesting because if you're trying to read that into that time period, you're actually completely being anachronistic. It's not true then. I mean, you're reading the 80s into the 1880s, and the 1980s into the 1880s. I mean, it's just not the same thing. Fundamentally not the same thing. I don't think the movie's just... I think that's an element of the movie, I do, but it's not really just about that. I mean, like, if both characters were sympathetic and destroyed each other, it would be more likely to be about that.
Right. I mean, I think that element is just window dressing at the end of the day. To me, it was, definitely a more personal or visceral story. I mean, that is more of a story of how our central character, for reasons which sometimes are gone into and which are not, cannot deal with other human beings. And usually that's a sign of someone who's been damaged in some way. That's the story, and the way his enemies, real or imagined, continue to either create a situation where he is damaged or he is reminded of the damage he has done to others. Really, is just the acceleration of his breakdown. And obviously at the end, I'm finished, being very dramatic about that. Again, I didn't even expect to discuss the movie in regard to trauma, but there it is again. And I think my guess is that it's an unmistakable, unavoidable part of just literature in general, and it doesn't even have to be modernist literature. We talked about how it being as old as literature itself. It's just something that's going to keep coming up. And it's something we're going to keep dealing with, and in a way that it sort of like leads to the question. Maybe we'll have it as our wrap up question: is why do we keep going back to trauma as something we want to encounter? Are we complicit in being victimized by trauma? Do we have compulsions that we can not control? And again, it doesn't even matter if it's... Well, maybe it does matter if we are traumatized people trying to confront our trauma, or we're voyeurs who can't help but can't help but get a rush from the emotional resonance of reading such things.
I think you can't parse that out. Honestly, I think that it's all there. And I know that's a cop-out answer, but I think it's an honest cop-out answer in a way. Like, you can't parse out. I don't even in your complicity to in a lot of ways, your complicity in reliving trauma is also your complicity in giving trauma. Because, for example, I think it's pretty clear, particularly in horror movies and films like, say, Stoker, that the identification, or in Dexter, maybe better Stoker. More people know Dexter. The identification is both with the killer and also with the killed simultaneously, and you're going through this to both be empowered and be disempowered. It is both catharsis and also revenge fantasy. I think I don't know that that's universally true. I can't speak for everybody, but it's something I've observed in our culture that very much seems to be the case. And I think maybe that's why a lot of our art, our popular art right now, I think the Will Graham character is perfect in that he illustrates this quite literally. But our popular art right now, who do you identify with? And I think, shows like Dexter or the way Hannibal went in the early 2000s, where you don't, it does seem like increasingly the identification goes away from the victimized and the catharsis of dealing with that to the revenge fantasy of being the victimizer.
Oh, I gotta tell you, like, on my Facebook wall, a friend of, well, it was like a distant family member, and so not related, but through marriage, had, like, some line, I guess she's a Dexter fan, she had some line, after, like, the Casey Anthony verdict was read and she was not guilty, she somewhat jokingly called for, wishing that Dexter would have a night alone with her, and people just seem to love that status. That really bothered me to no end, but I think it's absolutely right, and you really are going into it, is that, yeah, we are identifying with this as, like you said, it's revenge fantasy, and in a way it's not the only example of that, of like us saying like, oh, Dexter is representative of our social desire to seek justice. Batman always sort of was that, but Batman in its more intelligent form recognized the complications, but above and beyond that, too, I mean, like, Inglourious Bastards, or even Django. Those are manifestations of the victims trying to envision an alternative world where they're.
It's not the victims. I'm going to state up that is not the victims. That is an angry white dude.
Right, you're absolutely right. Yeah, Quentin Tarantino is not a Holocaust survivor, for example, nor is he a black man. Well, again, this is sort of why you can tell the difference even in literature. There's a difference between the Holocaust literature you get from Borowski, Primo Levi, and even Weissel compared to, people who write about it who have no direct relationship to it. There is a very big difference. And
Weissel and the Book Thief are very different books.
Absolutely.
I mean, they have a relationship to it from memory, but having a relationship to something from familial memory is not the same thing as having lived through it.
Yeah, exactly. And and I think theoretically, like Quentin Tarantino and 12 Years a Slave helped manifest that. And it's also why, that's different from, like, revisiting the trauma that you see depicted in art, like Chinatown, for example, where, we talked about it in our podcast, where Jack Nicholson's character, J.J. Gittes, has already in his past lived in a world where he, by virtue of his complicated, or his inability to completely understand a situation and perhaps bad empathy skills, led to a woman getting hurt, possibly likely dying, and throughout the film he makes, he basically recreates that situation again. You see that also in films like Vertigo, and so on and so forth. I mean, like, they're even, taking aside the whole notion of, like, the revenge films that you get from sort of guys like Quentin Tarantino, or even sort of uplifting motivational films like Schindler's List and 12 Years a Slave. There is also this other kind of revisiting trauma, which is somewhat different, again referenced from Chinatown and Vertigo, of the victim reproducing the situation in which he or she will continue to feel this pain.